Fairy is the newest type in Pokemon. It's only been around for about 10 years, but despite being much newer than every other type, Fairy is probably the best type in the entire game. And knowing this, I want to figure out what the best Fairy type Pokemon of all time is. Of course, I am strictly talking about competitive Pokemon here, the official competitive format. If your favorite Fairy type Pokemon is Dedenne, like that's totally cool and like good for you, but Dedenne is not going to appear on this list. There's also a lot of really good Fairy type Pokemon that aren't going to appear on this list because Fairy is the best type in the game, and so the good Fairy type Pokemon are really good. My initial list of Pokemon that could be considered for best Fairy type of all time was like 20 Pokemon. So yeah, there had to be a fair few cuts. In the end, I feel confident that these are the 10 best Fairy types, starting with Sylveon. Sylveon is like the quintessential Fairy type, right? I mean, it's like the Fairy type you think of when you think of Fairy type. I really like Sylveon. I think not only is the design good, but more importantly, it's fun to use. Sylveon feels fair in a way that not all Pokemon do. The main reason to use Sylveon has to do with its ability. Pixelate turns all normal type moves into Fairy type moves and gives them a damage boost. This allows Sylveon to use powerful moves that other Fairy type Pokemon aren't able to access. Most notably moves like Hyper Voice, Quick Attack, and Hyper Beam. Hyper Voice is just a really strong and consistent normal type moves that hits both targets, so turning it to like maybe the best offensive type in the game and giving it a damage boost is a pretty big deal. And if you want more burst, you can always use Hyper Beam, though that doesn't always work out super well. Sylveon hits pretty hard, and it also gets a damage boost from Pixelate, but its defenses are no slouch too. It's got very respectable bulk, and actually on the special side, it's really tanky. And it has a nice speed stat where it works both on Trick Room teams and Tailwind teams because it's kind of right in the middle, so it can lean into either direction. Sylveon is also one of the only Pokemon in the game that can use a Fairy type priority move because it gets Quick Attack, and Quick Attack when affected by Pixelate becomes a Fairy type move. Sylveon doesn't have a very high attack stat, but you can do some really fun things with the Quick Attack, such as attacking your own partner to activate weakness policy. This was used a little bit during Sword and Shield. My favorite use of Quick Attack Sylveon though was on maybe the most evil strategy I've ever used, which is Trick Eject Button. Okay, it probably isn't the most evil strategy, but it's up there. If you are unaware, basically you couldn't force Dynamax Pokemon to switch out, like Roar or Whirlwind or like Red Card. None of that would work. Like there was really no way to get rid of a Pokemon that had Dynamax. You kind of just had to get through the 3 turns. But if you use the move Trick, which switches the item of the user and the target, used by a prankster Pokemon, you could give the item Eject Button to whatever you targeted. And Eject Button was the only way in the game to get rid of a Dynamax Pokemon and force it to switch out. And so what we did was we had a priority Trick user with the ability Prankster give the item Eject Button to a Dynamax Pokemon, and then before they could attack, use Quick Attack Sylveon to force them out and basically nullify their Dynamax. It is one of the hardest I've ever laughed pulling it off, and I have very fond memories of that strategy. Sylveon is a very balanced Fairy type, but our number 9 slot I would say is not so well balanced, but that doesn't mean that it's not strong. I'm talking about Mawile. Well, specifically I'm talking about Mega Mawile. I think this is one of the coolest Mega evolutions because Mawile as a Pokemon is just abysmal, like really, really bad. Like there's really no reason to ever use it, and by not only giving it the Fairy typing, but also giving it a Mega evolution, they basically revitalized a classic Pokemon that otherwise would never see any play. Mega Mawile is so much stronger than regular Mawile because not only does it get the base stat increase by being a Mega evolution, its ability also changes to Huge Power. Huge Power doubles the attack stat of the Pokemon, and doubling a stat in competitive Pokemon is a really big deal. It also helps that Fairy is the best offensive type in the game, and that, in my opinion, Fairy and Steel is the single best type combination out of all of the different type combinations. Fairy and Steel is just ridiculous. They complement each other so well, both defensively and offensively. I guess that's kind of what happens when you take the best defensive type in the game and pair it with the best offensive type. But yeah, with Steel shoring up Mawile's resistances and Huge Power doubling its attack, it's really hard to get rid of, and then it hits super hard, especially because Fairy is a really difficult type to resist. Mega Mawile is pretty slow. That would be its main weakness, and so it was mostly used as a Trick Room attacker, turning that weakness into a strength. If you did get caught outside of Trick Room, you could still use the move Sucker Punch, which is relatively powerful and has an increased stage of priority, allowing Mega Mawile to move before other Pokemon. One thing that's really neat about Mega Mawile is that it's one of the few Mega evolutions that has like some value to keep it in its non-Mega form, because Mawile's ability is Intimidate. Intimidate will lower the attack stats of both opposing Pokemon every time it switches in, and so the advantage of keeping Mawile in its regular form is that you can potentially use Intimidate multiple times per battle. One thing you could do is lead with Mawile, see if it was was a good spot to Mega Evolve, and then if it was bad, switch it out, and the next time you brought it in, have Intimidate, and then you could Mega Evolve. Being able to cycle Intimidate and use it multiple times in a battle is very good. This is your Incineroar comment of the video. I know that there's somebody in the comments keeping track of how long it takes for Incineroar to appear in each video, and I think it's funny, so here you go. I'm doing it earlier than I otherwise would. Of course, Mawile is not as good an Intimidate cycler as Incineroar for a number of reasons, in large part because it's just so bad outside of its Mega Evolution. There were a couple funny matches back in the day where people would run 2 Mega Evolutions on a team, and occasionally they would bring both to the battle, and so maybe they would have like, oh, like Kangaskhan for Fake Out and then Mawile with the intention of Mega Evolving, but then they would like end up needing to Mega Evolve Kangaskhan and get stuck with baby Mawile, and it was just so sad. Anyway, Mawile never won the World Championships, but it was one of the best Pokemon in 2014 in the first year of X and Y, and it did win 2 international championships, so I think it definitely deserves a spot in this list, as I wouldn't say it was one of the best Mega Evolutions of all time, but it was a really good one, and it had a niche, especially early on when there were fewer Mega Evolutions available, as one of the only Mega Evolutions that could really stand up to Mega Kangaskhan. Our number 8 slot is a Pokemon that wasn't around during Mega Evolution, Grimmsnarl. Grimmsnarl is really cool, and I wasn't entirely sure where to put it on this list, but in the end I decided that number 8 was pretty fair because it's won an international championship and it got second at the World Championships as well. Pokemon that were introduced in Sword and Shield are a little bit funky because they didn't have the opportunity to play most of the events where they would have really been shining because of the pandemic canceling all events, but despite that, Grimmsnarl still did very, very well. Grimmsnarl is a dark and fairy type Pokemon that likes to use its typing primarily defensively. It has the ability Prankster, and so even though it has a sky-high attack stat, it actually ends up filling a role as a supporting Pokemon. It uses moves like Reflect and Light Screen to increase the entire team's survivability, and can also disrupt your opponent with moves that influence the speeds of the battle like Thunder Wave, or use other disruptive moves like Fake Out, as well as having a couple other nice options as well. Grimmsnarl was really incredible during the final format of Sword and Shield, where we were allowed to use powerful restricted Pokemon, 2 restricted Pokemon on each team. Grimmsnarl was really good because these restricted Pokemon were doubling their HP with Dynamax most of the time, and then you could increase their defenses with Reflect and Light Screen, making them just like basically impossible to KO. But Grimmsnarl was also really annoying to play against because it got this really annoying strategy. We talked about Trick Eject Button earlier, but the thing about Trick Eject Button is that it was considered a bit gimmicky because if the Pokemon that you want to trick just protects and then Grimmsnarl takes an attack, the eject button will activate and yeah, you'll get no value. And so what people did instead, they did use Trick, but they used the item Lagging Tail, which causes the user to always move last within its priority bracket. And so what that meant was that if Grimmsnarl didn't get to trick away the item, then Reflect and Light Screen would move last in its priority bracket, meaning like Reflect and Light Screen have higher priority than other moves, so they still go up before most normal attacks. But if your opponent had a threatening restricted Pokemon or a threatening Dynamax Pokemon, you could use Trick and then cause them to always move last for the rest of the battle. And so it was really annoying. Some players also use Trick with the item Iron Ball, which cuts a Pokemon's speed in half. This was valuable because it would immediately take effect, whereas Lagging Tail would only take effect on the following attack. And you could use Iron Ball's other effect, which is that it causes Pokemon that are flying type or floating to touch the ground. And so people would do stuff like Trick Iron Ball Grimmsnarl and Dynamax Groudon, and they would, like against Thundurus, for example, who otherwise would be pretty decent into Groudon, they would trick Thundurus, take away its item, cut its speed in half, cause it to touch the ground, and then hit it with like Max Quake, and then yeah, Thundurus would go bye-bye. I think it's a really cool strategy, and so I wanted to talk about it here. And yeah, Grimmsnarl is like also just recently, at the time I'm recording this, got second at the North American International Championships, which I think makes some sense because restricted Pokemon are now back. So it's a really cool support Pokemon that, thanks to its high base attack stat, can also be somewhat threatening offensively, and there's a Pokemon that I would definitely expect to see doing well in the future. Coming in at number 7 is another prankster user, Whimsicott. Whimsicott is a really cool Pokemon. Just like Sylveon, I think that it was like pretty well designed, where they built in very clear weaknesses to the Pokemon, but still gave it enough tools that it ends up being very powerful. Like I mentioned, Whimsicott is a prankster user, meaning it's able to use non-damaging moves before most other attacks. The main move it uses is Tailwind, which also influences the speed of the battle. Unlike Grimmsnarl though, who mainly picks a target and then makes it feel very sad and very slow, Whimsicott doubles its entire team's speed stats for the following 4 turns. And this is just for using the move once. Tailwind has always been one of the best moves in competitive Pokemon, and Whimsicott has been very consistently one of the top Tailwind setters. Tailwind isn't the only thing that Whimsicott can do though. Because of its prankster ability, it can use a lot of other really disruptive support moves. While Grimmsnarl tends to use mostly defensive supporting moves, Whimsicott tends to use offensive or disruption ones instead. The classic one is Encore, which forces the target to just use whatever move it just used over and over again for the next 3 turns. And this is really threatening because there's a lot of moves in Pokemon that players use that don't do a lot of damage, or like you don't really want to click multiple times in a row. Whimsicott can also use moves that mess with the opponent's stats. The most common ones over time were Fake Tears, which cuts the special defense of whatever it hits in half, basically allowing Whimsicott to pair with a really strong, fast special attacker and then just wipe any Pokemon it wants off the board. And Charm, which cuts an opponent's attack in half, basically making a physical attacker extremely sad. Whimsicott does appreciate its typing as well. As a grass type, it's immune to Amoonguss, which lets it do some neat things like mostly ignore Spore and Rage Powder. And as a fairy type, it's able to use the move Moonblast, which is one of the strongest moves in the game. It's slightly stronger than other moves that have no drawback. It never misses, and it also has a really high chance of lowering whatever it hits special attack stat. Whimsicott's Moonblast is great at doing chip damage to frail Pokemon or hitting Pokemon for super effective, or just launching it at special attackers and saying, hey, if your special attack falls, Whimsicott's kind of gotten a bonus here. There's been a lot of really cool Whimsicott sets over the years. One of the ones that was first popularized was using Whimsicott with Mega Gengar. Mega Gengar's Shadow Tag ability prevents any opposing Pokemon on the field from switching out unless they're a ghost type. And so you could use Encore from Whimsicott and disable from Mega Gengar to force a Pokemon to struggle. You could also use Fake Tears with the set as well. So you could either, like, if they protect from the Fake Tears and Sludge Bomb or Shadow Ball play, just Encore them in and then they're stuck and they can't switch and they can't attack. Or you could just, like, if the Pokemon is threatening, use Encore and Disable at the same time, force them to struggle for the next 3 turns and basically play a 2 versus 1 until they knock themselves out. My favorite Whimsicott set, though, is the one that won the World Championships back in 2017. Whimsicott used Normalium Z with the move Nature Power. Nature Power transforms into different moves depending on what the terrain is and a couple other conditions as well, but it still always used the Normalium Z crystal. Basically, what this allowed Whimsicott to do was use both Thunderbolt Z move or Moonblast Z move, depending on what the terrain was, and the team had the 2 terrain setters that could set up the terrains that would then change the move. It's a really cool Pokemon, and even nowadays when we have Tornadus, which is typically considered to be a better Tailwind setter, Whimsicott has still found its niche and is still doing well. Just as a reminder, if you're enjoying this video, maybe just double check and see if you're subscribed, if it's something that you're interested in. Subscribing is a great way to support the channel, and it's also a great way to tell YouTube, hey, like, this video is not so bad, maybe I'd like to see another one. I care a lot about trust when it comes to viewership. Like, I don't ever want to feel like people clicking on a video feel like their time is being wasted or that they didn't get a high quality product. And so of course, if you subscribe and decide that you know, at some point down the line, you don't want to watch the videos anymore, or you think that they're bad or whatever, like, I totally understand. But yeah, in the meantime, if you do want to subscribe, it does help the channel out a lot. Let's talk about the number 6 best fairy type of all time, Tapu Lele. This is the point in the video where things got really difficult for me in my research phase. I actually had to go really deep into the research because, as a disclosure, every Pokemon remaining on this list is incredible. Like, one of the top Pokemon in their generation, one of the top Pokemon of all time, like probably every remaining Pokemon is in the top like 20, maybe top 30, at least top 30 Pokemon ever. And the fact that Tapu Lele is number 6 is not a knock on Tapu Lele. It's merely a statement of how strong the remaining Pokemon are. Tapu Lele is one of the Tapu Pokemon. There are 4 of them, and each of them sets a different terrain when they switch in. Tapu Lele sets up the Psychic terrain, which nowadays is mostly used defensively as a way to stop priority attacks, as any priority move used on a grounded target will fail if Psychic terrain is up. But it also gives all Psychic type moves a damage boost, which is the main way that Tapu Lele used it. It's worth noting that in part because Tapu Lele was so strong, Psychic terrain got a nerf. It used to boost the Pokemon's power by 50% or Psychic type moves by 50%. Now it's closer to 30%, and by closer, I think it's exactly 30%. When Tapu Lele was first introduced in Sun and Moon, it very quickly established itself as one of the top threats. It won 6 international events over basically the 3 years that it was legal, and although it never won the World Championships, it did get 2nd place twice. The thing about Tapu Lele is that multipliers in Pokemon are really valuable. We saw this most recently with Miraidon, where even a move that's relatively low in base power can start picking up 1-hit KOs when you start multiplying it by like all these different factors. Tapu Lele could do this as well. Not only did it have a really high base special attack stat, and not only were its moves very high base power for what they were, like Psychic and Moonblast are both really like high consistent damage output, base power moves, but it could also multiply that even further with Psychic terrain and an offensive item like Psyche MZ, Choice Specs, or Life Orb. Psyche MZ Tapu Lele was one of the strongest Z moves that we saw, period. Like, when you started thinking about what's the strongest Z move my Pokemon might have to survive, that was like the upper bar. Like, most Pokemon probably can't survive this, so maybe you'll try to survive the Z move through Protect and then a regular Psychic. Psyche MZ wasn't the only way to use Tapu Lele though. I mentioned Life Orb, but the Choice Specs was actually pretty popular as well. Choice Specs Tapu Lele were often trained to be very defensive, actually, basically saying, hey, Tapu Lele is not so frail, but it's not so bulky. If I use the choice specs to make it super strong, then I can focus most of my like stat points into its defenses and HP to make it like survive a lot longer. Choice items are less scary on Tapu Lele than other Pokemon because of the psychic terrain stopping priority moves, most notably Fake Out, which is one of the best tools against Pokemon holding a choice item because they can't protect. Choice Scarf Tapu Lele was used as well, actually, and one of the coolest sets that Choice Scarf Tapu Lele used was Magic Room, which if you don't know what that does, I don't blame you. It's extremely niche. It's a move that turns off the effect of all items for the next 5 turns. There was a Pokemon that we'll talk about in a little bit that was extremely powerful but had to use its item to get like online, and so you could use Choice Scarf Magic Room Tapu Lele and turn off the item before it could attack, and then you would no longer be Choice Scarf locked into Magic Room because you had just disabled all the items. One thing that I think is really cool about Tapu Lele is that normally terrain setters tend to enable other Pokemon offensively. An example of this is how Miraidon powers up all of the other future Paradox Pokemon. Tapu Lele does power up other Pokemon, but in addition to powering up some offensive Pokemon, it could also power up some supporting Pokemon as well. The most clear case of this was Pokemon that had the ability Unburden. Although these Pokemon could technically be used with any terrain setter, they were really mostly used with Tapu Lele. Basically, Unburden will double a Pokemon's speed stat if its held item is consumed, and as we talked about earlier, being able to double one of your stats is a really big deal. The item that these Pokemon would use is the Psychic Seed item, which will give a Pokemon a special defense boost if the Psychic terrain is up, and then disappear. Effectively, using a Psychic Seed on a Pokemon with Unburden in Psychic terrain would not only double its speed stat, it would also make it 50% tankier. That's the reason we saw Pokemon like Drifblim and Excelgor actually get used a fair bit and actually both win international level events because they were really fast, especially tanky with the seed, and they had really disruptive move pools. Drifblim could use Will-O-Wisp to burn a target, as well as Tailwind to double its whole team's speed stat, which is especially threatening with like Choice Specs or Psyche MZ Tapu Lele, basically having both the speed and the power. And Excelgor could use moves like Acid Spray to basically be a better fake tiers that, cut the target special defense in half. It could use Final Gambit as a one-hit KO on most Pokemon. It could use Encore if anybody tried to play defensively. It had a really wide move pool. Tapu Lele also enabled offensive Pokemon, most notably Ultra Necrozma. Ultra Necrozma had a signature Z move called Light That Burns My Eyes that did enormous damage. Because it was a signature move, it was just stronger than most other Z moves, and Z moves were already like double the base power of most moves in the game, and so you can imagine that a signature Z move boosted by Psychic Terrain could do like almost unthinkable amounts of damage. Tapu Lele's Psychic Surge not only powered up Ultra Necrozma even further, but it also protected it from priority moves such as Sucker Punch, which would otherwise do super effective damage. Tapu Lele is an incredible Pokemon, and I wish I could put it higher up, but I just can't because the Pokemon above it are so incredible. Okay, we're into the top 5 now. Coming in at number 5, I went back and forth on this a lot, and it honestly feels truly criminal to have this Pokemon this low, but ultimately I'm putting Tapu Fini at number 5. Tapu Fini is one of the best Pokemon out of Sun and Moon, period. It won the World Championships twice in its first 3 years. What you have to understand about Tapu Fini is that it really was the only Tapu that was defensive. The other Tapus like to use their terrain offensively, but Tapu Fini's Misty Surge doesn't power up fairy type moves, thank goodness for that. Instead, it blocks all incoming status conditions and cuts the damage of dragon type attacks. Blocking all status conditions is really nice because like there's a fair bit of variance in competitive Pokemon with like critical hits, freeze, sleep, secondary effects like Thunderbolt paralyzing, all that good stuff. And Tapu Fini basically meant you didn't have to worry about any of it. Tapu Fini has the stats that make it really want to lean into being a defensive Pokemon, but what I think is interesting is that you weren't forced to use it that way. I top cut the World Championships with an offensive Tapu Fini with the Choice Specs item, which was somewhat commonplace back then. Basically, it's kind of like the reverse of the Tapu Lele we were talking about, where because Tapu Fini has such good defensive stats, you can afford to train it really offensively, and you wouldn't end up being super frail because you were just naturally so tanky. Tapu Fini could also be a setup sweeper. This was a set that was pretty popular, using Calm Mind to basically make it borderline unkillable on the special side, and it still had good natural physical defense, and after Calm Mind it hit as hard as Choice Specs, plus then you could use a healing item like Leftovers or Citrus Berry. Tapu Fini could also use a Z Crystal if it wanted. It could use Tapunium Z, which would do 75% of a target's remaining health to whatever it hit. It could use Waterium Z for big single target water type damage, Fairyum Z for Same thing with fairy type damage, or it could lean into its supporting role, which it was kind of designed for. Tapu Fini has an incredible move pool. It gets moves like Icy Wind to control the speed of the battle, Heal Pulse to heal its partners. Gravity was used a little bit. There was a set that was like Gravity with Primal Groudon, and you would also use Swagger. So you could use Gravity to make all Pokemon touch the ground and make your Groudon's Precipice Blades never miss. And then because Misty Terrain prevents all status conditions, you could use the move Swagger, which doubles a Pokemon's attack stat, but then causes them to be confused. But there was no drawback because the Misty Terrain was preventing all like status conditions, so you wouldn't even get confused. I actually almost won a tournament. I finished in the semifinals, I think, with Choice Scarf Tapu Fini with Soak, which turns the target to a water type. And I used this with Shedinja. I would use Soak on my own Shedinja, and if the opponent didn't have a grass or a grass or electric type move, Shedinja just won the game on one turn. It was really, really hard to deal with. Again, Tapu Fini won the World Championships 2 out of its first 3 years, and it was still good in Sword and Shield. It was a top Pokemon throughout the Players' Cups, and when live events returned in 2022, Tapu Fini was used not super like a ton, but a little bit on one of the main archetypes that used Trick Room. When I was making this list, I showed it to some of my friends who also are competitive Pokemon experts, and one person thought that Tapu Fini should have been the #1 Pokemon on this list. So to give you some idea of how good it was, like, yeah, like top competitive players think that maybe Tapu Fini is the best fairy type of all time. I don't personally agree, but Tapu Fini is so incredible that to act otherwise and act like 5th place is like a bad placement for it, I think would be a little bit disingenuous. But let's talk about some other fairy type Pokemon that are very, very good. If you only started following competitive Pokemon this year, I'm sure that you would be shocked if this Pokemon did not make it on the list. It's Flutter Mane. I was really torn about where to put Flutter Mane on this list. It's won 1 world championship, but it's only been legal for 1 world championship, and it's won 3 international level tournaments, but it's only been legal for 6. Of the 3 internationals that Flutter Mane didn't win, it got 2nd place at 2 and 3rd place at a 3rd. In other words, Flutter Mane has never finished outside of the top 3 at an international championship since it's become legal. Flutter Mane is arguably the single best Pokemon to come out of Scarlet and Violet. It is such an incredible Pokemon, which is also kind of crazy because on the physical side, it's extremely frail. Flutter Mane's HP and defense stats are abnormally low, but they are so low because of its other stats being so high. Flutter Mane's special bulk, speed, and special attack are just tremendous. Like, tremendous isn't even the right word. Like, if I had to show one example of power creep of Pokemon becoming stronger over time in a way that makes past Pokemon obsolete, I would show Flutter Mane. The rule used to be that the fastest a Pokemon could be without being like incredibly frail and pretty gimmicky was 130 speed stat. Like, that was the upper limit. That was where Tapu Koko was. That was where Mega Gengar was. And if you wanted to go any faster, you had to pay the price of basically some major weakness, like how Pheromosa has no bulk. Flutter Mane is the exception to that rule. In fact, Flutter Mane is the biggest example of that rule being obsolete. It is so incredibly fast, and it's also so incredibly strong. Flutter Mane probably isn't the most popular Pokemon because, like, yeah, it was so dominant, but I actually really like Flutter Mane, and I think it's a really cool Pokemon. I actually almost made an entire video just talking about why Flutter Mane is so cool. Flutter Mane is one of the most customizable Pokemon we've ever had. Just off the top of my head, you can use Focus Sash Flutter Mane, Choice Specs Flutter Mane, Booster Energy Special Attack Flutter Mane, Booster Energy Speed Flutter Mane. I used Sub Leftovers Flutter Mane before, which was, I mean, it was actually really good, to be honest. Like, it's not popular, but it was really good. Fairy Feather or Pixie Plate, they do the same thing. That's been used before. That's basically 7 different items, and I'm sure I'm forgetting about some off the top of my head. On top of that, the way that you train Flutter Mane changes how it plays a ton. Because Flutter Mane's physical bulk is so bad, there's some incentive to really leaning into it and basically training it to survive some powerful physical attacks. Doing so will completely change how Flutter Mane plays. On the other hand, you can also lean into its more offensive nature by making it really fast and really strong, but then it will be really frail. A lot of bringing out the full potential of Flutter Mane, in my opinion, is walking this tightrope where you want enough speed to outspeed the key threats. You want to hit hard enough that, like, you are happy that you have Flutter Mane, that it's doing, you know, big damage, and you want to make sure it's not going down to random stray attacks. And the training makes such a huge difference in how you have to play your Flutter Mane. Like, if your Flutter Mane is super defensive, you can be a little bit more risky, but if it's really frail, you need to make sure that your big attacks are really counting. The item also is so interesting because it basically almost always boosts one of Flutter Mane's stats, whether it's speed or it's special attack, or I guess it's defenses if you count like Focus Sash. If you're getting a speed boost from the booster energy, then you don't have to worry so much about your speed stat because you're going to outspeed everything anyway, right? Flutter Mane was clearly designed to be this offensive Pokemon with moves like Moonblast and Shadow Ball and Dazzling Gleam just being incredible type coverage and doing so much damage and having no real risk or drawback. But players also realized that Flutter Mane can be used as a supporting Pokemon. Moves like Icy Wind, Thunder Wave, and Taunt on a speed booster energy Flutter Mane have all gotten like a decent bit of play, and it basically basically transforms the way Flutter Mane plays completely with a focus on its speed and its bulk and its disruptive capabilities. It's really hard to get rid of in one attack. And although it doesn't hit as hard, it's mostly setting up for its partners to do most of the heavy lifting. Flutter Mane has spent the majority of the time that it's been legal as the #1 most used Pokemon. It climbed pretty quickly to that spot when it was first released, and like only recently has kind of relinquished control now that we have these really powerful restricted Pokemon back. With that being said, the reason that it's not higher is that like it hasn't been out for that long, and I'd like to see more of it before declaring it as like a, you know, a top 3 best fairy type Pokemon of all time, and because the Pokemon that are above it are just really, really, really good. So I guess let's talk about them. Starting with our number 3 slot, Tapu Koko. Tapu Koko is the final Tapu Pokemon that will be appearing on our list. Sorry to all the Tapu Bulu fans out there, you're gonna have to take it up with Rillaboom. Tapu Koko is an electric and fairy type that is the fastest of the Tapus and one of the most slippery. While Tapu Fini leans into its defenses and Tapu Lele leans into its offenses, Tapu Koko kind of leans into its speed, I guess. Tapu Koko is actually a special attacker, despite the fact that it has a higher attack stat than its special attack. But don't let this fool you. Tapu Koko still does immense amounts of damage. With a damage boosting item like Choice Specs or Life Orb and the electric terrain to also boost it, Tapu Koko doesn't hit as hard as Tapu Lele, but is still very, very strong. The thing that makes Tapu Koko so threatening, and the reason why I think it was so dominant and the reason why it's this high on the list and above Tapu Fini, is that it's extremely hard to pin down. You can think of Tapu Koko kind of like Miraidon's little brother. It uses the move Volt Switch, which does damage and then switches Tapu Koko out, and because it's so fast, that often means it's not taking an attack. So you can bring it in, Volt Switch, switch out, and then later in the game, bring it in, Volt Switch again, and just kind of put people in this blender where they never have a chance to actually damage Tapu Koko. And because of the electric terrain, especially the Gen 7 electric terrain when it was so strong, Tapu Koko was just doing a ton of damage with its Volt Switch. It's not that Volt Switch is the only thing that Tapu Koko had to do either. It could also use an offensive item. It could also use Thunderbolt, which is a stronger move and could pick up some big KOs, especially with like Choice Specs or Life Orb, or a Z Crystal. Electrium Z Tapu Koko was again one of the strongest Z moves. It's not quite as strong as Psychium Z Tapu Lele, but from such a fast Pokemon, you really don't want to have to deal with Electrium Z. I actually won the North American International Championships with Fairyum Z Tapu Koko, basically compensating for the fact that Tapu Koko's only real special fairy type move is Dazzling Gleam, which isn't very powerful, and so if you had Fairyum Z, you could suddenly turn that into a much stronger single target burst attack. Tapu Koko did mostly lean into these more offensive items, Life Orb, Choice Specs, Z Crystal, but you'd occasionally see some defensive items as well. Focus Sash was used a little bit at times, so I don't think it was ever the most popular set, just to keep Tapu Koko alive and forfeit a little bit of damage in exchange for a little bit of survivability. But some players actually ran Assault Vest. Assault Vest raises Tapu Koko's special defense by 50%, and in exchange, it won't let it use any non-damaging moves. So this Tapu Koko used moves like Electro Web to do some damage to slow down the speeds of the opponent, Nature's Madness to cut the remaining health in half of whatever it hits, and actually a move that's been removed from the game, Skydrop, which is basically like, you can think of it kind of like Forced Fly, where the user would pick up the target and just take them out of commission for a turn. There was this one thing that you could do if you had Tapu Koko and a Trick Room user left against a Pokemon that couldn't protect, where basically you would use Skydrop, pick up the target into the air, and have the Trick Room setter use Trick Room to reverse the speed order. And then the next turn, your Trick Room setter would be faster, you would attack, the opposing Pokemon would be next, but they would be in the air, so they couldn't attack. And then Tapu Koko would land and do a little bit of damage with Skydrop and let them out of the move, but they'd already tried to attack for the turn, and that turn, you would reverse Trick Room. And so it was basically this perma-lock where you could permanently lock down one Pokemon and not allow them to make any moves. It never came up for me personally, but it is like a really cool and very niche like strategy that you could pull off with Assault Vest Tapu Koko. As someone who played in Generation 7, I found Tapu Koko incredibly hard to deal with. It's so slippery and it did so much damage, and the sets that it could use would change how it played so much that I remember in 2017 when Tapu Koko was first released, I just like couldn't figure it out. Like no matter what I did, Tapu Koko just kept beating me. And yeah, like I think there's a reason for that. I think it's because Tapu Koko is just an incredibly powerful Pokemon. Tapu Koko not only won the World Championships twice, which is a really big deal by the way. Like most Pokemon haven't won the World Championships even once, and very few have won it more than once. But Tapu Koko also won 6 different national and international level events. For reference, Tapu Fini won 3 international level events, and so 6 double that is ridiculous. It's one of the strongest Pokemon to come out of Generation 7, and I think it absolutely deserves to be this high up on the list. Which brings us to just 2 Pokemon left. As a spoiler, I think the #1 slot actually may be kind of controversial, but before we talk about that, let's talk about the #2 slot, Zacian. Many of you may have expected Zacian to be at #1, and there's a strong case that Zacian should be at number 1. Zacian has won the only world championships it participated in. It's also won an international championship and got second at another one. Zacian had one of the most dominant performances we've ever seen out of any Pokemon, let alone a restricted Pokemon, in its first legal year. You were only allowed to have 1 or 2 restricted Pokemon in your team. In the format that Zacian was legal in, it was 2. And so because of that, you don't normally expect these restricted Pokemon to reach super high usage levels because you're just restricted in how many of them you can use. Zacian was the second most used Pokemon period at the World Championships in 2022. And I don't mean second most used restricted, I mean second most used Pokemon. It was on a whopping 66% of all teams. It was only behind Incineroar in terms of usage. And Incineroar was partially only that high because Zacian was everywhere, and Incineroar was one of the only ways to slow down Zacian. Zacian's ability Intrepid Sword gives it an attack boost every single time it switches in, or it did in Sword and Shield. For reference, Zacian's stats are already some of the best of any restricted Pokemon we've ever seen, and its attack stat is basically as strong as Primal Groudon and Mega Rayquaza. That's not factoring in the +1 boost from its ability Intrepid Sword, making it basically 50% stronger than those behemoths. Zacian, just like Mega Mawile, is a Steel and Fairy type Pokemon, which, if you recall, is the best type combination in the game. There is only one built-in weakness to that type combination, and it's the fact that neither Steel or Fairy can hit opposing Steel type Pokemon. Zacian doesn't have to worry about this though, because Zacian gets the move Sacred Sword, one of the most consistent and best fighting type moves in the game. You know what fighting hits for super effective damage? Steel. And Incineroar. Zacian's signature move did double damage to Dynamax Pokemon, which is a pretty big deal. Dynamax was what the entire game was kind of built around, and so having a Pokemon that could just ignore the defensive benefits of Dynamaxing is a pretty big deal. It's not like this was like a widespread phenomenon either. It was basically just Zacian, Zamazenta, and Xerneas who could do this, and Zamazenta and Xerneas were way worse than Zacian. Zacian received one of the single biggest nerfs of any Pokemon ever. Its ability was changed to only work once per battle instead of every time it switched in. It got a base stat nerf. They removed Dynamax Pokemon from the game, so its signature move doesn't have a secondary effect anymore. And most importantly, they changed the animation, so now its signature move doesn't look cool anymore. And the nerfs worked. Zacian is no longer a top threat, though some players still believe in it, and it's seen a little success in the current format. But I think how severe the nerfs are telling of how good Zacian was. For its incredible dominance and really legendary run, I think Zacian is the second best fairy type Pokemon of all time, but not the best. And I need to tell you something. The Pokemon that I've selected as the best fairy type Pokemon of all time has never won the World Championships. That's probably surprising because there are Pokemon on this list that have won it twice. But when I was making this list, I knew that I couldn't just decide based on number of accolades or number of, World Championship wins. What I really wanted to think about was how impactful was this Pokemon? How much of a menace was it? How did it center the game around itself? And under those conditions, there can be no denying that the best fairy type Pokemon of all time is Xerneas. Unlike every other Pokemon on this list except for Sylveon, Xerneas does not have a secondary typing. It is a pure fairy type Pokemon. Xerneas was introduced in X and Y, and the first time that it became legal, it completely took over the game. What you need to know about Xerneas is that it has a signature move called Geomancy. Geomancy doubles not only its speed stat, not only its special attack stat, but its special defense stat as well. We've talked a couple times about how doubling a Pokemon stats can have a pretty big impact. Xerneas doubles 3 of its stats, 3 of its 4 stats that it actually uses because it doesn't use its attack stat. It does take a move to do this. It has to click the move Geomancy, and it also requires the item the Power Herb. When I mentioned earlier Magic Room Tapu Lele, I was referring to Xerneas being the Pokemon that it shuts down. But spending 1 turn and giving up your item to double 3 of your most important stats is a very small price to pay. I think that they probably tried to build some counterplay into Xerneas by giving it very limited move coverage. It basically only learns fairy type attacks. It only needs to learn fairy type attacks, as it turns out. Xerneas' ability Fairy Aura powers up all fairy type moves when it's on the field, including its own. Between Moonblast, which as we've talked about is just one of the strongest moves in the game period, and Dazzling Gleam, which hits both targets, Xerneas doesn't need to run any coverage moves. You can't actually resist a boosted Xerneas. Even Pokemon that resist it are getting KO'd in 2 hits unless they specifically train themselves to be remarkably tanky. So to recap, we have a Pokemon that can double 3 of its most important stats and has the single best type in the game with both a powerful single target attack and one of the best spread moves. And that's a big part of the reason why when Xerneas was first introduced, it became used on the comp that was like the team to end all teams. This team is called Big Six, and it revolved around the duo of Xerneas and Primal Groudon. These Pokemon have pretty nice synergy. Xerneas can't hit fire, steel, or poison type Pokemon, all of which are weak to ground, which is Primal Groudon's typing, and Xerneas is weak to steel and poison, both of which are resisted by Primal Groudon. Because it is so incredibly specially bulky after Geomancy, it's also really good at bullying Primal Kyogre, who is Primal Groudon's main predator, and it also is really mean to Mega Rayquaza, who is used with Primal Kyogre to hopefully help against Primal Groudon. This team and its variants like Big B, Big C, and a whole bunch of other letters was the most dominant team that we've ever seen in all of competitive Pokemon. It's really the only example of a team like being found pretty early on and being completely unbeatable for pretty much the entire season. It's not that it won literally every tournament, though it came pretty close. It's just that whenever players would discover counterplay, the big X teams would just adapt. Like they would just find ways around it or become used to the matchup or make small tweaks. And this team was so incredibly unbalanced. It's the most dominant team out of any team ever in competitive Pokemon. And for those of you who are familiar with your VGC history, you'll know that this is the year that I won the World Championships. At the time, it felt like you had to choose between beating this big six kind of team composition or beating everything else. Like it was really hard to do both. And along with the help of my friends, I was able to build a team that could kind of actually do both. The way that we eventually conquered this team was by building out a very complex flowchart where every single turn of every single lead composition, we knew which play to make sure that we would end up on top. It required that level of planning and foresight and optimization in order to have a chance against what was like the strongest team of all time. And Xerneas was a huge part of that. And it wasn't even like Xerneas was forced to be on that one specific team. Xerneas has seen a lot of success over the years being used with other restricted Pokemon as well. We've seen it with Primal Kyogre, Lunala, Rayquaza. There's a whole bunch of other ways you can use Xerneas. But Xerneas never won the World Championships. Why is that? Well, it had the biggest target on its back out of any Pokemon in the format. Even more than Pokemon like Mega Rayquaza, Primal Groudon, and Primal Kyogre. Xerneas' ability to just run away with games was so threatening that players had to really counter it. Xerneas' presence alone caused really niche tech options to pop up. Moves like Haze, which remove all stat boosts, Roar and Whirlwind, which force a Pokemon to switch out, taking away their stat boosts, Magic Room, Tapu Lele we talked about, the item Red Card, which I wouldn't know what it did if I hadn't, had to deal with Xerneas. When a Pokemon hits a Pokemon holding a Red Card, the Pokemon that attacked is forced to switch out. I brought Red Card Heatran to Nationals in 2016. Didn't go very well for me. And there were a bunch of other options that players tried out as well. Basically, Xerneas was the bar. Like Xerneas was like you have to be this tall to play the game. You have to be this tall to ride the ride. And most League players couldn't clear that bar. By the World Championships, the players who were really seriously gunning to be world champion were so determined to get over that bar that they really devoted a lot of attention and care to just beating Xerneas. So it never won the World Championships, but despite being legal for only 2 formats, it won 7 international level events. As far as I'm aware, that's more than any other Pokemon on this list in just 2 legal rule sets. Oh, I guess technically it was legal in 2022, but they added Zacian, so I'm not counting that one because yeah, like it was basically like Xerneas not being in the game. Xerneas is a Pokemon that if I could, I would wish to never come back. In fact, it might be my #1 most wished for Pokemon to never return now that Smeargle can't learn Dark Void anymore. So even though it never won the World Championships, it was so dominant in a way that few other Pokemon can claim to be that I think it is the best fairy type Pokemon of all time. And that's my list. I hope you liked it. If you did, you might like this video I made on the best ghost type Pokemon of all time. It was actually surprisingly challenging. Like ghost types, you don't think about it, but there's a lot of really good ones. And let me just tell you, you're never gonna believe where Gengar ranks.